This investment did not fail because the sea was dangerous. It failed because one kind of risk was never discussed, and that absence shaped every decision that followed. When ancient maritime finance is explained today, the focus usually centers on storms, pirates, or shipwrecks. Those risks were obvious. They were priced into every contract, openly acknowledged in every negotiation. But history shows another pattern entirely. Systems where visible danger was carefully managed, while a quieter risk remained completely unexamined. Not ignored, not hidden, simply never named. So what happens when a financial system prices danger perfectly, but overlooks dependency and timing? Welcome to Financial Crimes Historian. Here, we explore the financial crimes that shaped nations, industries, and entire eras. That question leads us to the Mediterranean in the 4th century before the Common Era, to Athens, to Syracuse, to Massalia, which we now call Marseille, to grain merchants and ship captains who operated within a form of lending that had sustained maritime commerce for generations. The Romans called it foenus nauticum, sea interest. The Greeks knew it simply as maritime lending. In English, we call it bottomry, a term derived from the Dutch bodmerij, meaning the ship's bottom or keel. Bottomry was not speculation, it was income. A merchant could approach a lender before departure. They would agree on terms. The lender advanced funds, actual silver, handed over physically. The merchant used that capital immediately for ship repairs, cargo purchase, crew wages, and provisions for the voyage. If the ship completed its journey successfully, the borrower repaid the principal plus interest. If the ship was lost to what contracts carefully termed perils of the sea, storms, pirates, war, or shipwreck, the debt was extinguished entirely. The lender absorbed the loss. This structure wasn't unique to one city or one era. Historical records place bottomry's origins somewhere around 900 to 800 BCE, formalized in what scholars call the Rhodian Sea Law. Rhodes, that powerful island in the Aegean, codified maritime customs that would shape Mediterranean commerce for more than a millennium. By the time Demosthenes, the orator, was prosecuting legal cases in 4th century Athens, bottomry had operated successfully for over 400 years. The interest rates reflected this arrangement. Athens typically saw rates between 20 and 30%. The Emperor Justinian, centuries later when Rome formalized the practice, capped maritime loans at 12%, still well above the standard rate for ordinary lending. But here's what matters. Those rates were not viewed as extraordinary returns. They were compensation for a specific, measurable danger. The sea itself. Nothing in these arrangements promised windfalls or spectacular profits. The returns were moderate but dependable. Losses, when they occurred, followed known patterns. Ships foundered in storms off Cape Malea, cargoes spoiled during rough passages through the Bosphorus. Pirates operated in certain waters during certain seasons. This was intelligence, not mystery. These were calculable risks. When a ship returned safely, and most did, the creditor received exactly what the contract specified. No more, no less. The arrangement functioned like an annuity, not a venture. It attracted cautious capital precisely because it wasn't designed for growth. It was designed for preservation, with modest yield. Demosthenes, the elder, not the famous orator, but his father left his son an estate that included 70 minae in nautical loans. That was substantial wealth, representing years of prudent capital deployment. But it wasn't positioned as a gamble. It was structured as reliable income generation and wealth preservation, dressed in maritime commerce. That distinction mattered deeply in ancient financial culture. Wealth preservation was respectable. Speculation carried social stigma. Nothing here promised extraordinary profit. That was precisely why it attracted cautious capital. The language of bottomry contracts reinforced this stability. Legal documents from the period survive not many, but enough. They're formulaic, precise, almost ritualized in their structure and phrasing. A typical contract would specify the name of the vessel, its captain, and its home port. The amount of the loan in drachmas. The cargo being transported is described in detail. The route to be sailed, with acceptable ports named. The interest rate to be paid upon safe return is calculated carefully. Most importantly, it would detail the collateral, secured upon the hull and cargo, pledged against the keel, hypothecated to the bottom of the ship. This wasn't casual phrasing. It was legal architecture. The physical ship became the guarantee. If the voyage succeeded, the ship's arrival proved the loan's validity. If the voyage failed, the ship's loss absolved the debt. The lender's claim wasn't against the borrower's other assets, his land, his house, or his workshop. It was against this specific vessel on this specific journey. Athenian maritime law formalized this through the Dikae and Porikae commercial actions that gave Bottomry disputes their own specialized courts. These weren't ordinary contract cases heard alongside property disputes or theft accusations. They were treated as a distinct category of commercial law, acknowledged by the city as essential to trade. The procedures were different. The evidence requirements were different. The timelines were accelerated. Maritime cases received priority because delayed justice threatened commerce. Respected citizens witnessed the bonds. Public officials sometimes recorded them in the emporium, the commercial district where merchants congregated. The practice had operated for generations. That Rhodian sea law, scholars estimate, had been codified around 900 BCE. By Demosthenes' time, that represented nearly 6 centuries of continuous precedent. When something has functioned for that long, it stops being questioned. It becomes infrastructure. It becomes assumed. The language didn't deny risk. It disciplined attention. Every clause directed focus toward the ship itself, the vessel's seaworthiness, the captain's reputation, the route's seasonal dangers, the cargo's value and marketability. It focused lenders on the thing being pledged. But stability depends not only on what is pledged, it depends on who must still act. Let's look at the risks that were named. This was not naive finance. The merchants and lenders of Athens understood risk with remarkable sophistication. Their city depended on it. Athens consumed grain far beyond what Attica's thin soil could produce. The numbers tell the story. According to the orator Demosthenes, Athens imported approximately 400,000 metamnoi of grain annually just from the Bosporan kingdom in Crimea. That's roughly 4.8 million liters. And Crimea wasn't Athens' only source. Sicily, Egypt, Thrace all sent grain ships to Piraeus. Conservative estimates place Athens' population at 150,000 people in the 4th century BCE. Feeding that many required constant maritime commerce. Scholars estimate the city needed between 800 and 1,000 grain shipments annually. Each voyage was a financial transaction. Each transaction carried risk. This wasn't occasional commerce. It was systemic dependency. The city would starve without it. So the risks were studied, analyzed, and priced with precision. Environmental risk topped every calculation. The Mediterranean was treacherous in ways that were well documented. Winter sailing was largely prohibited. Seas between November and March were too violent. Spring and fall brought squalls that could materialize within hours, transforming calm waters into chaos. Summer offered better conditions, but also the risk of doldrums that could strand a vessel for weeks, consuming provisions and delaying cargo. Ship captains tracked seasonal patterns across generations. Lenders adjusted rates based on departure dates. Contracts often specified acceptable routes and prohibited dangerous shortcuts. Cape Malea off the southern Peloponnese was notorious. So many ships foundered there that Greek sailors had a saying, "Round Malea and forget your home." Operational risk received equal scrutiny. A ship's age mattered. Its construction quality. The experience of its crew. Lenders inspected vessels before advancing funds. They interviewed captains about past voyages, seeking evidence of competence. They checked for proper equipment anchors, sails, oars, rigging, and enough replacement materials for repairs at sea. One surviving Bottomry contract from Syracuse lists the ship's tonnage, describes its hull condition in detail, and names its previous successful voyages. This wasn't perfunctory documentation. This was due diligence, recorded evidence that could be referenced in court if disputes arose. Market risk shaped every calculation. Grain prices fluctuated based on harvest quality, regional conflicts, and seasonal demand. A cargo purchased in Sicily might double in value by the time it reached Athens during a shortage, or it might be worth less than the transport cost if another fleet arrived first and flooded the market. Sophisticated lenders structured their loans to account for this volatility. They advanced smaller amounts against uncertain cargoes. They demanded higher interest for voyages to markets with volatile pricing. Some contracts included provisions adjusting the repayment based on actual sale prices, creating something close to modern revenue-sharing arrangements. Political risk completed the analysis. Piracy wasn't random lawlessness. It was organized, territorial, and often seasonal. Certain waters were controlled by particular groups. Some could be negotiated with through tribute payments. Others couldn't, they simply took what they wanted. War between city-states closed entire routes. Political alliances shifted, and which ports were safe and which were hostile. A voyage planned during peacetime might become suicidal if conflict erupted before departure. Athens' enemies knew how to hurt the city, disrupt the grain supply. Lenders tracked all of this intelligence. They adjusted terms based on current conditions. They refused loans for routes they deemed too dangerous. They demanded higher rates for cargoes sailing through contested waters. The point is this: participants in the Bottomry system did not believe these transactions were safe. They believed they were complete. Every known danger had been identified. Every identifiable risk had been priced. The system wasn't built on ignorance or wishful thinking. It was built on careful analysis, centuries of experience, and selective comprehensiveness. And that's precisely what made it vulnerable. Let's examine the risk that wasn't. Number 1. Liquidity. The missing risk wasn't about uncertainty. It was about access. Consider the timeline of a typical Bottomry loan from Athens. A merchant approaches a lender in the Emporium. They negotiate terms. They agree on an amount, say, 2,000 drachmas, enough to purchase roughly 20 tons of grain in Syracuse. They sign a contract witnessed by other merchants. The lender hands over the silver, actual physical currency weighed and counted before witnesses. The merchant uses that silver immediately. Some goes to ship repairs discovered during inspection. Some purchase cargo in Sicily. Some pays the crew's advance wages. Some covers provisions for the 40-day round trip. The ship then sails. Weeks pass, sometimes months, if weather delays departure or if storms force the vessel to shelter in intermediate ports. During that entire period, 4 weeks, 6 weeks, 2 months, 3 months, the lender's capital is frozen, not invested elsewhere, not generating returns, not available for other opportunities, simply inaccessible. If the lender suddenly needs those funds for another merchant seeking capital, for a family emergency, or for purchasing land that becomes available, they cannot access them. The silver isn't lost. It hasn't vanished. It's just locked in motion, somewhere between Syracuse and Athens, moving at the speed of wind and current. This is the crucial distinction between value and liquidity. The collateral, the ship and cargo, absolutely has value. In many cases, substantial value. A merchant vessel in the 4th century BCE could cost anywhere from 5,000 to 10,000 drachmas. The cargo might be worth 3,000 to 4,000 drachmas more. That's real wealth, significant capital. But that value cannot be realized while the vessel is at sea. A ship in the Aegean, from the lender's perspective, has no practical difference from a ship that has sunk. The lender cannot inspect it to verify its condition, cannot confirm it still exists, cannot verify the cargo remains aboard, cannot exercise any claim against it, cannot access any of the value those assets represent. Legal ownership of the ship means nothing if you cannot reach the ship. This creates a timing problem that's almost philosophical. The lender possesses a valid claim, documented, witnessed, and legally enforceable against an asset that is simultaneously real and inaccessible. The loan document proves ownership. The legal system acknowledges that ownership, but the Mediterranean Sea prevents any actual exercise of that ownership. Liquidity is not about wealth, it's about timing. And in Bottomry, timing belonged entirely to the borrower. Number 2. Time mismatch. Credit was issued up front. Repayment was deferred to an uncertain future. This structure seems obvious. It's inherent to any loan, but Bottomry had no checkpoints between departure and arrival. None. In modern lending, periodic payments create accountability. Monthly mortgage installments prove ongoing solvency. Quarterly interest on bonds demonstrates continuing commitment. Annual credit line reviews verify that circumstances haven't fundamentally changed. These aren't just revenue collection, they're verification mechanisms. Each payment proves the borrower remains solvent and cooperative. Each interaction creates an opportunity to detect problems early, before small issues compound into systemic failures. Bottomry had none of this infrastructure. Once the ship left port, the lender had no contact until it returned. Months could pass with zero information, no progress reports, no interim payments. no verification of any kind. The ship might be delayed by weather entirely legitimate. It might take an alternate route to avoid pirates, perfectly reasonable. It might stop at additional ports for repairs, sometimes they're necessary. It might sell partial cargo at intermediate markets to fund those repairs occasionally. A prudent move. All of these were legitimate possibilities. Captains needed operational flexibility. The sea was inherently uncertain. Rigid requirements would make voyages impossible. But they were also convenient explanations for other activities. The system assumed that time would remain cooperative, that voyages would proceed as planned, that delays would be temporary and explainable, that merchants would operate in good faith even when circumstances made bad faith profitable. But time is not cooperative. Time is indifferent. A merchant could extend a voyage deliberately, load different cargo at an intermediate port and sell it for personal gain, sell portions of the original cargo and replace it with something cheaper, make unauthorized stops to conduct side businesses, change the ship's destination entirely if better opportunities appeared. None of these actions necessarily violated the contract if they could be justified as responses to unforeseen circumstances. And who determined what circumstances were unforeseen? The merchant. Who controlled the narrative about what happened during the voyage? The merchant. Who decided when conditions were suitable for return, when the voyage was truly complete? The merchant. Information traveled slower than intent. By the time a lender learned about a delay, the delay had already been justified. By the time they heard about a route change, the route had already been sailed. By the time they discovered the cargo had been sold, the sale had already occurred, and the silver distributed or sent elsewhere. This wasn't fraud. Not yet. This was temporal asymmetry. The borrower controlled the present. The lender could only react to the past. Number 3. Counterparty failure. The deepest vulnerability wasn't about ships, seas, or weather. It was about dependency. Every Bottomry loan required the sailor to act in good faith, to complete the voyage as planned, to return to the home port rather than sailing elsewhere, to honestly report what had occurred during the journey, to repay the loan plus interest once the cargo was sold. None of these could be compelled while the ship was at sea. The legal claim existed, the contract was valid, the debt was real, but enforcement required the borrower's voluntary compliance, his choice to honor obligations rather than pursue alternatives. This created an extraordinary imbalance. If a merchant decided to breach the contract, they controlled every element of the deception. They could hide the ship in a distant port, Massalia, Carthage, Alexandria, and claim it had sunk. They could sell the cargo elsewhere and report it as lost to pirates. They could simply never return to Athens, starting fresh in another city under different arrangements. What recourse did the lender have? They could bring a lawsuit, but lawsuits require defendants. If the merchant stayed away, there was no one to sue. If they did return, they controlled the narrative. They could describe misfortunes, storms, pirates, port seizures, unexpected expenses that sounded entirely plausible and couldn't be disproven. Or worse, they could admit the ship was fine but argue the cargo had been legitimately sold in a different market for valid commercial reasons, and the proceeds had been used to purchase different goods, which were then lost to genuinely unfortunate circumstances during the return voyage. How does a lender challenge that story? The witnesses are the merchant's own crew. The documents are written by the merchant. The sequence of events occurred beyond any observer's reach. Demosthenes, the orator, the famous one, not his father, built much of his early legal career prosecuting exactly these kinds of cases. 4 of his surviving speeches deal with maritime lending disputes. His courtroom narratives reveal the dynamics clearly. In one case, recorded as Speech 32 against Xenothemis, Demosthenes represented a man named Demon, who was likely his cousin. Demon had lent money to a shipowner named Hegestratos for a grain voyage from Syracuse to Athens. But the voyage never happened as planned. Hegestratos and his partner Xenothemis, a man from Massalia, borrowed money from multiple lenders in Syracuse. They told each lender the ship carried valuable cargo pledged as security. Hegestratos would confirm to those lending to Xenothemis that the ship held large quantities of grain. Xenothemis would confirm to those lending to Hegestratos that the cargo was genuine. As one was the ship owner and the other a passenger, they were naturally believed in what they said about each other. But, as Demosthenes explained to the Athenian court, immediately upon receiving the silver, they sent it home to Massalia. They put nothing on board the ship. Nothing. The ship sailed empty. The plan was simple. 2 or 3 days from land, Hegestratos would go down to the hold at night and cut a hole in the ship's bottom. Demosthenes would remain on deck with the passengers, pretending ignorance. The ship would sink. The crew and passengers would escape in the ship's boat. The borrowers would keep all the silver and blame the loss on the sea. The agreement being, as was usual in all such cases, that the money had to be repaid only if the ship reached port safely. If the ship sank, the debt was extinguished. But the plan failed. The noise of Hegestratos cutting through the hull alerted passengers and crew. They rushed below and caught him in the act. Hegestratos, realizing the game was up, took flight. He was hotly pursued by others aboard. In the darkness, he tried to leap into the ship's boat, trailing behind. He missed. He fell into the Mediterranean and drowned. Thus, as Demosthenes noted with grim satisfaction, a miserable man met a miserable end. He suffered the fate he had intended to bring about for others. The ship survived. It was brought safely to the island of Cephalonia. Demosthenes then had the audacity to bring a lawsuit in Athens, claiming he was the injured party and demanding compensation. Here's what matters. This wasn't an isolated case. Demosthenes references it as typical of a known pattern. Contract law from the period even included provisions for ships concealed in distant ports, requiring borrowers to pay double the interest rate if a vessel was found hidden after being reported lost. You don't write legal provisions for rare events. You write them for common ones. The missing risk wasn't uncertainty about the sea. It was dependency on the sailor. And that dependency was never priced, never explicitly discussed, never even formally recognized as a risk category in the way environmental or market risks were cataloged and analyzed. It was simply assumed. Let's discuss why silence persisted. 1. Social trust. Maritime communities were tight. Ship captains operated out of the same ports for years, often decades. They dealt with the same lenders repeatedly. Their reputations were public knowledge, discussed openly in the emporium where merchants congregated daily. Everyone knew who had completed successful voyages and who had encountered unfortunate circumstances suspiciously often. This social pressure functioned as informal enforcement. A captain who defaulted on one lender would find it difficult, sometimes impossible, to secure another loan. Word traveled fast in the small world of maritime commerce. The same moneylenders, the same cargo merchants, and the same ship owners all knew each other. They shared information. They warned each other about suspicious characters. This created genuine accountability. Most captains valued their reputations more than any single fraudulent profit. The ability to secure future loans, to command respect among peers, to operate freely in major ports, these were worth protecting. But this social mechanism also created something more subtle. The assumption that accountability was sufficient. Because most captains did return, most loans were repaid, most contracts were honored, the system's historical success rate appeared to validate the lack of formal enforcement mechanisms. Past performance became the guarantee. When Demosthenes the Elder structured his estate around 70 minae in nautical loans, he wasn't being reckless. He was following centuries of precedent. The practice worked. It had always worked. His father had probably done the same. His neighbors did the same. Respectable Athenian citizens routinely deployed capital this way. But past performance under benign conditions doesn't predict behavior under stress. When a captain faced genuine financial distress, when cargo spoiled unexpectedly, when an emergency expense consumed the entire voyage's profit margin, or when market prices collapsed and returning meant certain bankruptcy, the social incentives reversed. At that point, the reputational cost of defaulting became less than the financial cost of repaying. The sailor's best move was to stay away, to claim the ship was lost, and to start over in a different port under a different identity with fresh capital. And crucially, lenders had no way to distinguish between genuine loss and strategic default. A ship that sank in a storm off Cape Malea looked exactly like a ship hidden in Massalia or Carthage. A cargo lost to pirates generated the same outcome as cargo sold in Egypt, with the proceeds pocketed. The evidence was identical. The physical result was the same. The sailor's story was the only differentiator. Trust didn't fail because it was misplaced. Trust failed because it went unexamined. The system relied on voluntary compliance from people who faced overwhelming incentives to defect under certain conditions. And those conditions, financial distress, unexpected loss, competitive pressure, personal crisis, were inherent to maritime commerce. They would inevitably occur. The question wasn't whether stress would test the system. The question was, when? The social bonds that made Bottomry work most of the time were the same bonds that obscured when it was starting to fail. Each successful voyage reinforced confidence. Each honest captain justified the assumption that the next one would be honest too. Until they weren't. 2. Legal and expertise intimidation. Maritime law was extraordinarily technical. The Decii Emporici Athens commercial courts operated under specialized rules that differed substantially from ordinary litigation. Cases had to be filed within specific timeframes, usually before the end of the sailing season. Only certain types of contracts qualified for these expedited procedures. Evidence requirements were strict and particular. Most Athenian citizens didn't understand these procedures. They had no reason to. Maritime law was a specialized domain, relevant primarily to merchants, ship owners, and professional lenders. If they needed to bring a case, they relied on professional speechwriters, logographers like Demosthenes to navigate the system. This created an expertise barrier. Questioning a Bottomry contract meant questioning centuries of precedent. It meant challenging respected legal traditions. It meant implying that generations of merchants and lenders had structured their affairs incorrectly. That's a difficult argument to make in any era, especially when the practice was defended by authorities. The Rhodian Sea Law, one of the oldest maritime codes in existence, formalized Bottomry procedures around 900 BCE. Roman law later sanctioned higher interest rates specifically for sea voyages because, as legal texts explicitly stated, the price is for the peril. When the Emperor Justinian codified Roman law in the 6th century CE, Bottomry was enshrined in the Digest, the authoritative compilation of legal opinions. The practice wasn't questioned. It was systematized. That's over 14 centuries of continuous legal recognition. When a practice is that old, that established, that embedded in legal frameworks, it becomes difficult to critique. Challenging the structure of Bottomry wasn't just questioning a contract type. It was questioning the foundation of Mediterranean commerce. And there's a final dynamic at work. The people most capable of identifying the system's weakness were the people most invested in its continuation. Successful merchants, wealthy lenders, experienced ship captains, they all benefited from Bottomry functioning smoothly. They had the expertise to recognize the enforcement gap. They understood temporal asymmetry and counterparty risk, even if they didn't use those terms. But they also had the capital to absorb occasional losses. For them, individually, the system worked. Most loans were repaid. Most voyages succeeded. The losses that did occur were manageable at the personal level and collectively expected as the cost of doing business. The vulnerability was structural, not personal. No single participant had sufficient incentive to redesign the entire system. The costs of change would be borne individually: new procedures, new verification mechanisms, new enforcement infrastructure. The benefits would be distributed collectively: more secure lending, reduced fraud, and systematic improvements. That's a classic collective action problem. So the silence persisted. When a contract is old enough, it stops being questioned and starts being assumed. Collapse as a revelation. The system didn't collapse suddenly, it eroded. Cases like the Hegestratos affair didn't create new problems. They exposed existing ones. They made visible what had always been present but obscured by general success. The trigger events varied across different cases, different ports, different time periods. Sometimes a delayed return stretched from weeks into months into years, with no word. Sometimes a disputed cargo generated competing claims from multiple lenders who all believed they held security against the same goods. Sometimes a ship vanished with no witnesses, no wreckage, no bodies recovered, no confirmation of what actually happened. In each case, creditors suddenly needed to enforce their rights, and enforcement proved impossible. A lender would petition the courts. They would file their contract, produce their witnesses, demonstrate that the loan was valid and unpaid. But the defendant was gone, sailing under a new name in Carthage. Or the defendant appeared with a detailed, eloquent explanation of misfortunes, storms off Sicily, pirates near Crete, unexpected port seizures by hostile city-states that sounded entirely plausible and couldn't be disproven. Or worse, The defendant admitted freely that the ship was fine, but argued the cargo had been legitimately sold in a different market for valid commercial reasons. Market prices in Athens had collapsed due to a bumper harvest in Egypt, they would explain. So rather than taking a devastating loss, they'd sailed to Corinth, where grain prices were higher. The proceeds were used to purchase wine, which was then lost when the ship was damaged in a storm and the amphorae broke and leaked into the bilge. The legal system could adjudicate what happened. It could weigh testimony and examine evidence, but it couldn't compel what hadn't occurred. If the silver was gone, if the borrower was genuinely bankrupt, if the ship was truly lost or sold elsewhere, the contract's validity became irrelevant. You can't collect from nothing. What became clear painfully, expensively, publicly clear through case after case in Athens's commercial courts was that Bottomry's security was conditional. The contract worked perfectly when the borrower chose to honor it. It failed completely when the borrower chose not to honor it. That choice was always present. It had always been present, for centuries, through thousands of successful voyages. The difference was that it had usually been made in the lender's favor, guided by reputation concerns and social pressure. But usually isn't always. Once creditors discovered through bitter experience that enforcement was impossible after the fact, once this became known widely rather than whispered privately, the fundamental premise shifted. Nothing new was discovered at the moment of collapse. What changed was that the missing risk could no longer remain hidden. Lenders had to confront what they had always been depending on, not the borrower's contractual obligation backed by legal claims on collateral, but the borrower's voluntary cooperation. The borrower's decision to honor the agreement even when circumstances made breach profitable. Once dependency became visible, the system could no longer function as designed. Interest rates would have to rise dramatically to compensate for counterparty risk, but higher rates would make legitimate voyages unprofitable. Honest merchants couldn't afford to borrow at rates that priced in systematic fraud. Credit would contract. Fewer voyages would be financed. Commerce would suffer. Athens' grain supply would be threatened. Or the legal structure would have to change fundamentally. Enforcement mechanisms would have to be created. Checkpoints during voyages where lenders could verify cargo. Mandatory route reporting at intermediate ports. Third-party verification of cargo loading. Splitting loans across multiple lenders so no single party bore full risk. Insurance separated from lending so different parties absorbed different risks. But those changes would increase transaction costs and reduce operational flexibility. They would eliminate the very features that made Bottomry attractive in the first place: simplicity, speed, efficiency. The system couldn't be reformed without destroying what made it functional. And eventually, it was replaced. Modern maritime finance uses preferred ship mortgages, publicly recorded security interests that other parties can verify, insurance policies separated from lending arrangements, allowing specialized risk assessment, enforceable interim claims so creditors aren't frozen out during voyages, verification mechanisms at multiple points. Each of those innovations addressed the problem Bottomry never named. Let's discuss how you can spot missing risk. When you examine any financial system, ancient or modern, simple or complex, ask 4 questions. First, what must continue uninterrupted for this system to work? In Bottomry, the borrower had to voluntarily return, honestly report what occurred, and willingly repay. Those weren't mere hopes or preferences. They were structural requirements. If anyone failed, the entire structure collapsed. The contract became worthless paper. The collateral became inaccessible. The lender's position became unenforceable. When a system's function depends on unbroken cooperation, dependency becomes the unpriced risk. Second, what value exists but cannot be accessed on demand? Bottomry's collateral was absolutely real. The ship had genuine value. The cargo had market value. But that value was inaccessible during the only period when enforcement might be necessary while the voyage was in progress, while the ship was at sea, while the borrower controlled both the asset and the information about that asset. When collateral cannot be liquidated during the loan's duration, you don't actually have security. You have a promise about future security, and promises depend on the promisor's continued cooperation. Third, whose behavior is assumed rather than enforced? Every Bottomry contract assumed the merchant would act in the lender's interest, not required through oversight, not compelled through verification, not monitored through checkpoints. Assumed based on social bonds, reputation concerns, and historical precedent. When assumed behavior becomes structural dependency, you're not pricing risk appropriately. You're hoping risk doesn't materialize. Fourth, what risks are described in detail and which are merely implied or absent. Bottomry contracts extensively detailed environmental risks, operational risks, market risks, and political risks. They said nothing explicit about counterparty risk, enforcement feasibility during voyages, or temporal asymmetry between credit provision and repayment verification. The absence was telling. The most dangerous risks in financial history are not hidden in complex structures or buried in fine print. They are simply never named. Now, here is a question for you. Think about the financial systems of today: modern lending, investment platforms, digital wallets, and retirement accounts. What dependency are you assuming rather than verifying? What value can you claim but not access when you need it? What must continue working uninterrupted for your financial position to remain secure? Share your thoughts in the comment section. Have you encountered a situation where assumed cooperation failed, when timing didn't work in your favor, where what seemed secure proved inaccessible? These patterns repeat across centuries. The names change, the technology evolves, but the structural weaknesses remain remarkably similar. If this analysis changed how you think about risk, hit that like button. If you want more investigations that train your judgment rather than your emotions, subscribe to the channel. And share this with someone who needs to think more carefully about what's missing from their risk assessment. This channel examines financial failure through structure, not scandal. The next investigation begins immediately.